The United States tried to rebuild Japan. Instead, it transformed it. Modern Japan was not simply restored after World War II. It was reshaped, reorganized, and quietly engineered inside an American-designed global system. The policies Washington used to demilitarize Japan, stabilize its economy, and fold it into a US-led order ended up doing something far bigger. They created the foundations of one of the most powerful industrial economies in human history. America wanted a peaceful ally. It helped create an economic superpower. This is not a story of simple generosity. After 1945, the United States faced a devastated Japan. Cities were burned to ash, industry lay in ruins, millions were homeless. The country had no resources, no empire, and no military future. Washington's goal was clear. Japan would never again be a threat. It would be rebuilt as a stable, dependent partner inside America's post-war system. The United States occupied Japan directly. It rewrote its constitution. It dismantled the military, it restructured political institutions, and it began reorganizing the economy from the ground up. At first, the plan focused on punishment and control. Large industrial conglomerates were broken apart. Land was redistributed. Corporate power was limited. The idea was to prevent any concentration of economic strength that could fuel future militarism. But as the Cold War emerged, American strategy shifted. China went communist. The Korean War erupted. The Soviet Union expanded influence across Asia. Suddenly, Japan was no longer just a defeated enemy. It became a frontline state. Washington needed a strong economic anchor in East Asia, a country that could manufacture, trade, stabilize the region, and serve as a pillar of the American security system. And so the US quietly reversed course. Instead of suppressing Japanese industry, it began rebuilding it at scale. Instead of limiting manufacturing power, it encouraged it. Instead of keeping Japan weak, it began helping it grow. American capital flowed in. US technology was transferred. Access to US markets was opened. Japanese firms were given space to rebuild behind protective policies while exporting into the largest consumer economy on Earth. The United States guaranteed Japan's security, removing the need for massive military spending. This single decision changed everything. With defense handled by Washington, Japan could pour resources into factories, infrastructure, education, and technology. While other nations spent heavily on armies, Japan spent on engineers. Shipyards expanded, steel production surged, electronics firms emerged, automobile manufacturers scaled rapidly. Japan was not just recovering, it was accelerating. The American-led global order offered something even more powerful than money: stability. Trade routes were protected by US naval power. The dollar anchored global finance. Western markets remained open. Japan could export freely without worrying about war, currency collapse, or regional conflict. This created the perfect environment for long-term industrial planning. Japanese companies focused on quality, efficiency, and incremental innovation. Government agencies coordinated investment. Banks provided patient capital. Universities trained technical workforces. While America assumed Japan would remain a dependent junior partner, Japanese planners were studying something deeper. They were learning how power actually functioned in the modern world. They saw that industrial capacity created influence, that supply chains created leverage, that technological leadership determined prosperity, that access to markets was the real weapon of the post-war era, and they designed their economy around mastering all of it. By the 1960s and 1970s, Japan's growth exploded. Consumer electronics flooded global markets. Japanese cars challenged Detroit. Shipbuilding dominated world production. Steel output rivaled the largest Western economies. What looked like an economic miracle was actually something more deliberate. It was a system optimized for industrial dominance. The United States had given Japan exactly what it needed: security without military burden, access to massive consumer markets, technological exposure, financial stability. Inside that protected environment, Japan refined production to levels no one else could match. Efficiency became culture. Precision became identity. Long-term planning became normal. And slowly, quietly, Japan moved from rebuilding to leading. By the 1980s, American policymakers began to panic. Japanese companies were buying US real estate. Automakers were overtaking market share. Electronics firms dominated global manufacturing. Trade imbalances widened year after year. The country America had rebuilt to be a stable partner was now outperforming its own industries. Once again, Washington realized it had created something far more powerful than intended. But by then, the transformation was already complete. Japan was no longer a recovering nation. It was an industrial superpower, and the system that produced it was the very system designed by the United States. The same open markets meant to integrate Japan had given it scale. The same security umbrella meant to keep peace had freed capital for growth. The same financial order meant to stabilize the world had allowed Japanese firms to expand globally without risk. America had not just rebuilt Japan, it had engineered the conditions for its rise, and the consequences of that design were only beginning to unfold. As Japan's industries expanded, something deeper was taking shape beneath the surface. This was not simply rapid growth, it was coordinated development. While American companies largely competed as individual firms, Japanese industry moved as a system. Government ministries identified strategic sectors, banks directed long-term financing, corporations shared research and stabilized supply chains. Universities fed talent directly into national priorities. Where markets elsewhere chased short-term profits, Japan optimized for decades. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry became the nerve center of this strategy. It guided capital toward automobiles, steel, electronics, chemicals, and precision machinery. Imports were managed carefully. Domestic firms were protected while they scaled. Export capacity was pushed relentlessly. From the outside, it looked like free market success. Inside, it was industrial choreography. And all of it operated safely under the American security umbrella. Because Japan did not need to fund large armed forces, it could mobilize enormous resources into economic expansion. Research laboratories multiplied. Factory automation accelerated. Infrastructure connected ports, cities, and industrial zones at unprecedented speed. High-speed rail wasn't just transportation, it was productivity. Ports weren't just trade hubs, they were global supply chain engines. Education reforms emphasized engineering, mathematics, and technical precision. Entire generations were trained to build, refine, and improve complex systems. The result was not only volume, it was quality. Japanese manufacturers pioneered just-in-time production, lean management, and relentless process improvement. Defects dropped, efficiency soared, costs fell, while reliability increased. This combination proved devastating for competitors. American factories built for mass production struggled to match Japanese precision. European firms burdened by older industrial structures fell behind. Within a single generation, Japan was setting the global standard for manufacturing excellence. Cars lasted longer. Electronics performed better. Machines ran more efficiently. Consumers around the world began choosing Japanese products not because they were cheaper, but because they were superior. Market share followed, and with it, influence. The more Japan exported, the more it accumulated capital. The more capital it accumulated, the more it reinvested into innovation and expansion. The cycle fed itself. Growth created capability. Capability created dominance. Dominance created more growth. All of this unfolded inside the stable, predictable order built by the United States. American naval power protected global shipping lanes. The dollar anchored financial transactions. US consumer demand absorbed endless waves of imports. Japan could focus entirely on becoming better, faster, and more advanced. It was industrial evolution under perfect conditions. By the late 1970s, Japan had moved beyond rebuilding. It was redefining entire industries. Semiconductors surged. Robotics entered factories. Consumer electronics became smaller, faster, and more powerful. Precision machinery enabled manufacturing revolutions across the globe. The country that once lay in ruins was now one of the world's most technologically sophisticated economies. And the transformation kept accelerating. Japanese corporations expanded abroad. Factories opened across Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America. Supply chains stretched worldwide but remained coordinated from Tokyo and Osaka. Japan was no longer just exporting goods. It was exporting industrial systems, management techniques, production standards, technological ecosystems. Entire regions reorganized manufacturing around Japanese methods. Meanwhile, American policymakers continued assuming the alliance guaranteed loyalty and dependence. But the reality was shifting. Japan's economic power was becoming independent of US control. Its firms commanded global markets. Its financial institutions held massive capital reserves. Its technology base rivaled Western leaders. Its industrial depth allowed rapid adaptation across sectors. The country had learned to operate at scale inside the American system. And scale, once achieved, creates autonomy. By the early 1980s, Japan's trade surplus with the United States ballooned. American factories closed. Entire communities hollowed out as imports replaced domestic production. Public concern turned into political pressure. Japan was no longer viewed simply as a partner. It was becoming an economic challenger. Books warned of Japanese domination. Media stories predicted the decline of American industry. Executives traveled to Tokyo to study what had gone wrong at home. The same system that had rebuilt Japan was now reshaping global competition, and Washington was beginning to realize the consequences of its post-war design. The security guarantee that freed Japanese resources had supercharged growth. The open markets that encouraged trade had given Japanese firms massive scale. The stable financial order that promoted recovery had enabled decades of uninterrupted expansion. What had been intended as reconstruction had produced strategic economic power. Yet from Japan's perspective, this transformation was not opportunistic. It was essential. The memory of wartime destruction remained vivid. Resource scarcity was constant. Dependence on foreign supplies felt dangerous. Economic strength was not merely prosperity. It was survival. Industrial depth meant resilience. Technological leadership meant security. Export dominance meant access to resources and capital. Every factory built reduced vulnerability. Every innovation increased independence. Japan had absorbed the central lesson of the modern world. Power no longer flowed only from armies. It flowed from production, and the country was determined never again to be weak. The irony was that this lesson had been taught by the very system meant to manage it. American strategy had created the most efficient industrial machine on Earth. And as Japan's capabilities expanded, the balance of economic power began to tilt in ways Washington had never anticipated. As Japan's economic momentum surged, the United States began to sense that the post-war balance it had designed was drifting out of alignment. What had once looked like successful reconstruction was now producing something far less controllable. Japanese companies were no longer just competing, they were overtaking. Automobiles rolled off Japanese assembly lines with lower defect rates and higher fuel efficiency. Electronics arrived smaller, cheaper, and more reliable. Machine tools that powered factories across the world increasingly came from Japanese manufacturers. Entire American industries felt the pressure. Steel mills closed, auto plants downsized, electronics firms lost market share. Communities that had once thrived on manufacturing began hollowing out. What had been framed as healthy trade now felt like displacement, and political tension followed. Washington accused Tokyo of unfair practices, currency manipulation, closed domestic markets, state-backed industrial policy. The language of partnership slowly shifted toward rivalry. But from Japan's perspective, nothing unusual was happening. It was simply executing the development model that had been encouraged for decades. Build capacity, improve efficiency, export relentlessly, reinvest constantly. This was the very logic the American-led system rewarded. Yet the scale of Japan's success was creating consequences the system was never designed to handle. By the mid-1980s, the imbalance had become impossible to ignore. Japan's trade surplus with the United States soared. American debt to Japan grew. Japanese capital flowed into US assets at unprecedented levels. Skyscrapers in New York and Los Angeles were purchased by Japanese firms. Golf courses, movie studios, and major corporations followed. To many Americans, it felt like economic conquest. The nation rebuilt by US policy now appeared to be buying pieces of the US economy itself. Fear spread quietly. Books warned that Japan would soon dominate global finance. Commentators predicted the decline of American industry. Politicians promised to push back. The alliance remained intact, but the trust beneath it was straining. In 1985, the United States took a decisive step. Together with major allies, Washington pressured Japan into the Plaza Accord, an agreement designed to sharply raise the value of the Japanese yen against the dollar. The goal was simple: make Japanese exports more expensive, make American products more competitive, shrink the trade imbalance. On paper, it was economic adjustment. In reality, it was an attempt to slow Japan's rise. The currency shift hit Japanese manufacturers immediately. Export margins tightened, growth slowed, the era of effortless expansion ended. But something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing, Japan adapted. Corporations accelerated automation to offset higher costs. They moved production overseas while keeping high-value design and technology at home. They doubled down on innovation rather than retreating. Once again, pressure produced refinement. Yet the financial effects of the stronger yen created a new dynamic. Cheap credit flooded the Japanese economy. Asset prices surged, stock markets soared, real estate values exploded. Tokyo land prices reached levels where the imperial palace was said to be worth more than entire US states. What began as a currency correction turned into one of the largest asset bubbles in modern history. For a moment, it looked like Japan's dominance would become permanent. Its banks became the largest in the world. Its corporations sat atop global rankings. Its financial power rivaled Wall Street itself, but bubbles do not last. When Japan's asset markets collapsed in the early 1990s, the economy entered a long stagnation. Growth slowed dramatically. Prices fell. Debt mounted. To many outside observers, it appeared that Japan's superpower moment had ended. Yet beneath the surface, something important remained. The industrial base was still intact. The technological depth was still world-class. The production system still defined global standards. Japan had not lost its capabilities. It had merely shifted into a different phase of economic life, and those capabilities continued shaping the global economy quietly. Japanese firms dominated key components inside nearly every modern product: advanced machinery, sensors, precision parts, specialty chemicals, and manufacturing equipment that few competitors could replicate. Even as growth slowed at home, Japan remained embedded at the core of global production. The country no longer chased volume. It controlled the bottlenecks. Critical inputs that modern industry depended upon increasingly flowed through Japanese suppliers. Semiconductor materials, precision robotics, advanced manufacturing tools. Japan had evolved from exporter of finished goods to master of industrial infrastructure. This shift made its influence less visible, but more durable. While headlines focused on economic stagnation, Japan quietly held leverage over the technologies powering the modern world, and all of it traced back to the same post-war design: the American security umbrella that freed capital, the open markets that created scale, the stability that allowed decades of uninterrupted industrial planning. Even when growth slowed, the structural strength remained. Japan had become something far more resilient than a fast-growing economy. It had become a foundational pillar of global manufacturing. The United States had tried to manage reconstruction. Instead, it had helped build an industrial system so deep that it could weather currency shocks, asset crashes, and demographic change. Once again, the unintended consequences of American strategy were revealing themselves. The pressure meant to rebalance competition had forced Japan into even more advanced specialization. The slowdown meant to curb influence had pushed Japan toward controlling critical technologies, and the country that was once rebuilt as a dependent partner now held quiet power across global supply chains. The transformation was no longer about growth alone. It was about structural control, and the implications of that shift were only beginning to reshape the balance of economic power. By the time the world began speaking about China's rise in the 21st century, Japan's transformation had already rewritten the rules of modern economic power. Not through conquest, not through domination, but through depth. Japan no longer needed rapid growth to shape global outcomes. It sat inside the machinery of production itself. From semiconductor fabrication to robotics, from advanced materials to precision manufacturing tools, the technologies that powered modern economies increasingly depended on Japanese expertise. Factories across Asia, Europe, and North America quietly relied on Japanese components that had no easy substitutes. Supply chains that appeared global often rested on invisible Japanese choke points. The country, rebuilt under American guidance, had become one of the most structurally important industrial players on Earth. This was not accidental. It was the logical outcome of decades spent optimizing for resilience, efficiency, and technological leadership inside a stable, open, US-designed system. Where the United States focused on consumption, Japan mastered production. Where American firms chased quarterly returns, Japanese institutions planned for generations. Where Washington assumed markets alone would shape outcomes, Tokyo coordinated entire industrial ecosystems. Each approach reflected the environment that shaped it. And the environment that shaped Japan had been created by American policy. The security guarantee removed existential threat. Open trade created scale. Financial stability enabled long-term investment. Access to technology accelerated learning. Together, they produced an economy engineered for industrial dominance. The United States never intended this outcome. Its goal was peace, stability, a dependable ally in East Asia. But by demonstrating that power in the modern world flowed from production capacity rather than armies alone, Washington taught Japan the most important lesson of the post-war era. Economic strength was national security. Every factory was defense. Every innovation was sovereignty. Every supply chain was leverage. Japan absorbed that lesson fully, and then it built an economy around it. Even the moments of pressure reinforced the transformation. Trade friction forced efficiency. Currency shocks drove automation. Economic slowdown pushed specialization. Each challenge hardened Japan's structural position rather than weakening it. The country moved steadily away from visible dominance toward quiet indispensability. Where growth once measured success, control of critical technologies now defined it, and control proved far more durable than expansion. The irony is that Japan's rise was never a rebellion against the American system. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. Open markets rewarded efficiency. Stability favored long-term planning. Scale rewarded coordination. The United States had built a global order meant to generate prosperity and peace. Japan simply mastered its mechanics better than anyone expected. What emerged was not a challenger built through hostility. It was a superpower shaped through participation, a nation that grew powerful by learning how the system worked and optimizing inside it. Just as earlier empires unintentionally forged their future rivals through trade, industrialization, and integration, modern American power had done the same. Not through malice, through structure. History rarely produces rivals through sudden conflict. More often it creates them through opportunity. The British Empire industrialized Germany. European colonial systems fueled nationalist states. And the American-led global order transformed Japan from ashes into one of the most sophisticated industrial economies ever built. None of this means Japan's rise was inevitable, but it was understandable. Nations adapt to the environments that surround them. They optimize for the pressures they face. They build strength in the ways the system rewards. Japan was shaped by a world where markets were open, security was guaranteed, and production determined influence. So it built the most efficient production engine on Earth. The United States believed it was rebuilding a peaceful ally. Instead, it engineered the conditions for a new form of power, one rooted not in armies but in industrial depth, not in conquest but in indispensability, not in dominance by force but in dominance by function. Japan did not rise by rejecting the American-designed world. It rose by mastering it, and by doing so, it demonstrated a truth that now defines global competition. Modern superpowers are not built only through military strength. They are built through supply chains, technology, infrastructure, and coordinated economic systems. The United States taught Japan how that world worked, then gave it the stability and access needed to excel within it. What emerged was not the dependent partner Washington once imagined, but a nation whose industrial foundation became essential to the modern global economy. The superpower Japan became was not an accident of recovery. It was an unintended consequence of strategy, a product of reconstruction policies that created resilience, of security guarantees that freed capital, of open markets that produced scale, and of a global system that rewarded those who mastered production. The United States set out to rebuild Japan. In doing so, it helped create one of the most structurally powerful economies in history, not by force, not by design, but by building a world where industrial mastery became the ultimate form of power. And Japan learned that lesson better than anyone ever expected.